Sometimes the people society overlooks completely are the very ones who end up saving what matters most to those who never saw them coming. David Miller had spent 3 weeks waiting for any response from Phoenix Aerospace Industries, his carefully crafted resume disappearing into the black hole of corporate hiring algorithms. He had no idea that Samantha Reynolds, the tech billionaire who controlled the defense contracting empire, had personally flagged his application as unsuitable for corporate standards, just hours before fate would reveal how catastrophically wrong that judgment really was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning alarm buzzed at 5:15 a.m. in the cramped two-bedroom apartment in East Denver, the same relentless sound that had marked David's days for the past 4 months since losing his position at Rocky Mountain Defense Solutions. He moved through his routine with the practiced silence of someone who understood that 9-year-old sons needed their sleep, especially when that sleep was often interrupted by the nightmares that came with Jake's anxiety disorder following his mother's sudden death 16 months ago. David padded barefoot across the worn linoleum floor of their modest kitchen, the morning light filtering through windows that faced an alley rather than the Colorado Rockies that rose majestically 30 miles away in a world he could barely afford to visit. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building where the elevator worked sporadically, and the heating system groaned through the night like machinery in distress, but it was theirs. The rent was manageable, the neighbors were decent, and it was close enough to Jake's school that the walk wouldn't strain their carefully managed budget. The coffee maker, a simple black machine that David's late wife Rebecca had bought at a garage sale 6 years ago, gurgled to life with the familiar sounds of their morning routine. While it worked, David opened the folder that lived on their small kitchen table, the one containing Jake's therapy appointments, school records, and the stack of bills that seemed to multiply when he wasn't looking. Jake's anxiety treatment had become more expensive since Rebecca's death, requiring specialized counseling and medication that their COBRA insurance barely covered. 3 more weeks, and even that inadequate coverage would disappear, leaving them vulnerable to medical costs that could destroy their fragile stability. David ran his fingers along the edge of the latest invoice from Dr. Sarah Martinez, the child psychologist who'd been helping Jake process his grief. $1,623 for last month's sessions, medications, and emergency consultations. The number represented nearly half of their monthly income from David's part-time work at Torres Electronics, where he repaired industrial equipment for restaurants and small businesses. It was honest work that utilized his engineering background, but it paid a fraction of what his skills were actually worth in the corporate world that seemed determined to keep him locked out. "Morning, Dad." Jake's voice carried the slight hoarseness that came with the emotional exhaustion of a child carrying burdens too heavy for his age. He appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing his favorite pajamas, the ones with the cartoon rockets that Rebecca had bought him for Christmas 2 years ago, back when their biggest worry was whether the old car would pass its emissions test. "Morning, buddy," David replied, closing the bill folder and sliding it behind the coffee maker where Jake wouldn't see the numbers that kept him awake at night. "How did you sleep? Any good dreams?" "I dreamed about space again," Jake said, climbing onto his chair and letting his feet dangle above the floor. "I was fixing a satellite that was broken, and all the astronauts were really happy because I made their communication system work again." David's chest tightened with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Jake's fascination with aerospace engineering was inherited, honestly. David held 2 degrees in aerospace systems and had spent 7 years designing navigation software for military aircraft before budget cuts eliminated his position. Now Jake dreamed of following in his father's footsteps, unaware that the industry his father had once thrived in now viewed him as unemployable due to a gap in his resume caused by caring for a grieving child. "That sounds like an amazing dream," David said, starting Jake's breakfast routine. "What kind of satellite was it?" "The kind that helps people talk to their families when they're far away," Jake replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possess. "The astronauts told me that fixing it was really important because people were sad when they couldn't talk to the people they love." David paused in his preparation of scrambled eggs, struck by his son's instinctive understanding that connection mattered more than technology. It was the kind of insight that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with engineering in the first place. Not for the complexity of the systems, but for their ability to help people accomplish things that mattered. After breakfast, David walked Jake to Jefferson Elementary, their morning journey taking them through a neighborhood that was gentrifying rapidly around them. New coffee shops with names like Artisan Roast and Mindful Brew had appeared on corners where corner stores used to serve the working families who'd called this area home for decades. The rent increases would eventually force them out, David knew, but for now it remained affordable enough for a single father with an engineering degree he couldn't seem to use. "Dad, why don't you just tell the space companies that you're really good at fixing things?" Jake asked as they walked, his small hand warm in David's as they navigated the morning sidewalk traffic. "It's complicated, buddy," David replied, using the same explanation he'd given dozens of times. "Companies have specific requirements about experience and employment history. They want people who haven't had breaks in their careers." "That's stupid," Jake declared with the absolute certainty of childhood logic. "You fixed Mrs. Peterson's entire security system when 3 different companies said it couldn't be repaired." David smiled despite the weight of their circumstances. Mrs. Peterson's home security network had been a fascinating puzzle, an integration problem involving incompatible software platforms that had stumped 2 major security firms and a specialty electronics contractor. David had solved it in 4 hours, tracing the issue to a firmware conflict that required custom programming to resolve. He'd refused payment, accepting only homemade cookies that Jake had devoured over 2 days. "Sometimes being good at something isn't enough," David explained. "Sometimes you need the right kind of experience, or you need to know the right people, or you need to have worked for the right companies." "That's really stupid," Jake repeated, his voice carrying the indignation of someone who believed the world should make sense. 25 miles south, in a glass tower that rose above the heart of Colorado Springs, Samantha Reynolds stood before floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the aerospace landscape that had made her one of the most powerful women in America. At 36, Samantha controlled Phoenix Aerospace Industries, the defense and satellite contractor that her father had built from a small engineering firm into a company that designed navigation systems, communication networks, and orbital platforms for both government and commercial clients. The executive suite occupied the entire top floor of Phoenix Tower, its minimalist design and premium materials reflecting the precision and excellence that defined the company's brand. Samantha had inherited control of Phoenix when her father suffered a heart attack 4 years earlier, and she'd spent every day since proving that she deserved the position through merit rather than genetics. The company now employed over 12,000 people across 15 facilities, with contracts worth billions of dollars, and a reputation for solving the most complex technical challenges in the aerospace industry. Samantha's assistant, Marcus Chen, entered with the morning briefings and a tablet displaying the day's priorities. "The engineering review meeting is in 30 minutes, Marcus announced. "The team wants to discuss the orbital communication project that's been experiencing integration delays." "What's the status on new hiring for the technical positions?" Samantha asked, not turning from the window that framed her view of an empire built on innovation and precision. "HR sent over the latest applicant reviews yesterday. Most of the candidates are standard. Recent graduates from MIT and Caltech, some mid-career transitions from established firms. Nothing exceptional." Samantha moved to her desk, a custom piece made from reclaimed aircraft titanium that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The stack of resumes sat beside her computer, each one representing someone who wanted to work for Phoenix Aerospace Industries, to be part of the company that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in aerospace technology. She flipped through them with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to make quick decisions based on pattern recognition. Most were predictable, impressive educational credentials, experience at recognizable companies, the kind of backgrounds that suggested competence without necessarily indicating brilliance. Then she reached the application of David Miller, aerospace systems engineer, age 34. The resume showed promise initially: dual degrees in aerospace engineering and computer science, 7 years at Rocky Mountain Defense Systems working on navigation software for military applications. But then came the gap. 16 months of unemployment with only part-time electronics repair work to show for recent activity. The cover letter mentioned family obligations and expressed enthusiasm for contributing to Phoenix's mission of advancing aerospace technology. Samantha set the resume aside without a second thought. Phoenix Aerospace Industries didn't hire people with employment gaps, especially not single fathers whose priorities might be divided between work and family obligations. The company's success depended on employees who could commit fully to demanding projects with tight deadlines and high stakes. Personal circumstances that interfered with professional excellence were luxuries that Phoenix couldn't afford. She reached for her phone and called HR directly. "Marcus, about the engineering applications. You can send the standard rejection to David Miller. He's not what we're looking for. Any particular reason I should note for our records? Employment gap, insufficient recent experience in corporate environments. The usual professional standards we maintain." Samantha hung up and returned to the window, her reflection ghost-like against the glass that separated her from the world below. The city spread out beneath her building, full of people living lives she'd never fully understood. People who repaired things with their hands, who worried about medical bills, who made career sacrifices for family obligations that successful executives learned to delegate or ignore. People whose applications she rejected without understanding the expertise that employment gaps might be hiding, the innovative thinking that came from solving problems with limited resources, or the dedication that came from working not just for professional success, but for the survival and happiness of the people they loved most. In a few hours, those two worlds would collide in the most dramatic way possible, proving that sometimes the people we dismiss without consideration possess exactly the skills needed to save what matters most. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The email arrived at 9:31 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks and 4 days after David had submitted what he considered his most carefully crafted application yet. He'd spent hours tailoring his cover letter to Phoenix Aerospace Industries, researching their recent orbital communication projects, and identifying specific ways his experience with navigation software could contribute to their mission. The hope had been building slowly over those 25 days. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe someone would see past the employment gap to recognize the expertise underneath. David was sitting at the small desk in their living room, the same folding table where Jake did his homework each evening, when his laptop chimed with the incoming message. The sender was no reply at phoenixaerospace.com, and the subject line read, "Application Status Update, Engineering Position #A3142. His stomach clenched with familiar dread, but he forced himself to open it anyway, clinging to the slim possibility that corporate politeness might disguise good news. "Dear Mr. Miller," the email began with the sterile formality that had become painfully familiar over 4 months of rejections. "Thank you for your interest in the aerospace systems engineer position at Phoenix Aerospace Industries. After careful review of your qualifications, we have decided to move forward with candidates whose experience more closely aligns with our current project requirements and corporate standards." David read the words twice, each repetition driving the disappointment deeper into his chest. The language was identical to 19 other rejections he'd received since losing his position at Rocky Mountain Defense Systems. The same polite dismissal. The same suggestion that his qualifications were somehow insufficient. The same corporate doublespeak that reduced 7 years of innovative engineering work to misaligned experience. "We appreciate the time you invested in your application and wish you success in your career endeavors. Please feel free to reapply for future positions that may better match your background." The sign-off was automated, bearing no individual name or signature. Just Phoenix Aerospace Industries Human Resources Department, followed by a legal disclaimer about equal opportunity employment that felt like mockery given the systematic nature of his rejections. David closed the laptop and sat back in the creaky folding chair that served as his office furniture. Through the window, he could see the morning clouds gathering around the Rocky Mountains, obscuring the peaks where companies like Phoenix made decisions about people's lives with the casual efficiency of sorting mail. Somewhere in one of those corporate offices, someone had spent perhaps 30 seconds reviewing his application before deciding he wasn't worth a phone interview. What David couldn't know was that Samantha Reynolds had made that decision personally, viewing his resume through the lens of corporate prejudices that valued uninterrupted career trajectories over actual problem-solving ability. The irony was devastating. David possessed exactly the kind of innovative thinking that Phoenix claimed to value, the ability to solve complex integration problems that had stumped their own engineering teams on multiple occasions. The timing was particularly cruel. Jake's therapy appointment was scheduled for that afternoon, and David had been hoping to deliver good news about a potential job interview. Instead, he would have to continue pretending that their financial situation wasn't becoming increasingly desperate, that the medical bills weren't consuming their savings faster than his part-time income could replenish them. David walked to the kitchen and poured himself another cup of coffee from the machine that had become his morning ritual of hope and disappointment. The bill folder still sat behind it, a constant reminder of the mathematics of survival that dominated their daily existence. He pulled out the latest statement from Dr. Martinez's office and did the calculation he'd memorized but continued to repeat anyway. 3 more months of current expenses would exhaust their remaining savings, leaving them dependent entirely on his electronics repair income. The work at Torres Electronics was satisfying in its own way, solving diagnostic problems, repairing complex systems, helping small business owners keep their operations running smoothly. But it paid $26 an hour for irregular work, a fraction of what his aerospace engineering background should command in Colorado's technology-driven economy. The skills that had once designed navigation systems for military aircraft were now applied to fixing restaurant freezers and retail security systems. David's phone buzzed with a text message from his neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived in the apartment next door with her elderly mother. "David, my mother's oxygen concentrator is making strange noises again. Could you take a look when you have time?" It was the 4th medical equipment emergency this month in their building. David had become the unofficial technical support for families who couldn't afford professional repair services, troubleshooting everything from CPAP machines to wheelchair electronics. He'd fixed Mrs. Rodriguez's concentrator twice before, replaced Mr. Chen's blood pressure monitor, and rebuilt the Garcia family's home dialysis system from scratch. All of it pro bono work that demonstrated exactly the kind of problem-solving expertise that corporate hiring managers claimed they couldn't find in his application materials. Of course, David texted back, "I'll stop by after Jake gets home from school." The irony wasn't lost on him that he was more trusted with complex technical problems by his neighbors, who had witnessed his capabilities firsthand, than by companies that made hiring decisions based on resume formatting and employment timelines. Mrs. Rodriguez didn't care about David's 16-month gap in corporate employment. She cared that David could diagnose and fix problems that left other people helpless. David returned to his laptop and opened his job search spreadsheet, a meticulously maintained document that tracked every application, response, and rejection. Phoenix Aerospace Industries joined the list as rejection number 20. Color-coded in red alongside Lockheed Martin, Boeing, SpaceX, and 16 other aerospace companies that had deemed his qualifications insufficient for their standards. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Companies wanted candidates with continuous employment histories, preferably with name-brand firms that provided instant credibility. They wanted people who could demonstrate recent experience with cutting-edge projects, not engineers who'd spent the past year and a half caring for grieving children while taking whatever work they could find to pay medical bills. What they didn't want, apparently, was someone whose problem-solving skills had been sharpened by necessity, whose creativity had been enhanced by working with limited resources, whose dedication had been proven through personal sacrifice rather than corporate ladder climbing. The very experiences that had made David a more resourceful and determined engineer were precisely the factors that disqualified him from opportunities to apply those enhanced capabilities. David closed the spreadsheet and opened a new browser window, beginning another day of searching job boards for positions that might value expertise over pedigree. The process had become mechanical. Scan descriptions for requirements he could meet, craft tailored applications that highlighted relevant experience, submit materials into digital black holes that rarely acknowledged receipt, let alone provided meaningful feedback. At Jefferson Elementary, 8 miles away, Jake Miller was having his own struggles with institutional systems that seemed designed to overlook rather than recognize individual worth. During morning recess, he'd overheard 2 teachers discussing budget cuts that would eliminate the after-school robotics club that had become his favorite part of the academic week. "It's a shame," Mrs. Patterson was saying to Mr. Williams as they supervised the playground. "Jake Miller has such natural talent for mechanical systems and problem-solving. He's been designing these incredible robotic mechanisms out of recycled electronics." "Budget priorities," Mr. Williams replied with the weary resignation of educators who'd learned to do more with less. "The district wants to focus resources on standardized test preparation. Robotics clubs are considered enrichment rather than essential education." Jake pretended to be absorbed in the swing set while listening to their conversation, but inside he was calculating the same kind of mathematics that occupied his father's attention. If the robotics club disappeared, he would lose the one place at school where his interests were encouraged and developed. Just like his father was losing opportunities to use his engineering skills because companies couldn't see past employment gaps, to recognize actual capabilities. The parallel experiences of father and son illustrated a broader systemic problem: institutions that claimed to value talent and innovation while consistently overlooking both when they appeared in unconventional packages. David's expertise was dismissed because it came with family obligations, while Jake's potential was sacrificed to budget constraints that prioritized measurable outcomes over individual development. Neither of them knew that in just a few days, David's dismissed application and overlooked expertise would become the crucial factors in saving the life of someone whose family had never experienced the casual cruelty of systematic rejection. The same skills that Phoenix Aerospace Industries had deemed insufficient would prove to be exactly what was needed when institutional systems failed and only individual courage and competence could prevent tragedy. The rejection email from Phoenix Aerospace Industries represented more than just another professional disappointment. It was a symptom of a system that consistently undervalued the very qualities it claimed to seek: innovation, problem-solving ability, dedication, and the kind of character that emerges from overcoming adversity rather than avoiding it. Basic, but sometimes the most devastating rejections create the exact circumstances necessary for truth to emerge, for real worth to be recognized, and for the people who've been systematically overlooked to prove that expertise and character matter more than credentials and conformity. David Miller had just received his 20th rejection, but he was about to demonstrate that the most important qualifications couldn't be measured by employment timelines or corporate pedigrees. They could only be proven when everything else failed, and only competence and courage remained. The kidnapping attempt began with the kind of meticulous planning that only came from professional criminals who understood how wealth moved through Colorado Springs. Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez had spent 3 weeks studying the patterns of Phoenix Aerospace Industries, executive protection protocols, timing the routes that Samantha Reynolds, 11-year-old daughter Lily, took between her private school and various afternoon activities. Lily Reynolds attended Mountain View Academy, an exclusive institution in Colorado Springs where the children of aerospace executives received educations that cost more per year than most families earned. The school's security was impressive, but predictable: armed guards at the main entrance, surveillance cameras throughout the campus, and coordination with local police that created an illusion of impenetrable protection. But Tank had learned during 12 years of high-stakes crime that even the most sophisticated security systems had vulnerabilities, usually created by the human need for routine and convenience. The weak point in Lily's protection was her Tuesday afternoon piano lesson at the Steinberg Music Conservatory, a prestigious institution 4 blocks from Mountain View Academy. Samantha Reynolds had insisted that her daughter walk to lessons rather than arrive by armored car, believing that some semblance of normal childhood was important despite their family's extraordinary wealth and visibility. The route took Lily through Pioneer Park, a tree-lined area with multiple entry and exit points that would be impossible to secure without shutting down an entire neighborhood. Tank's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Disable the security detail's vehicle with an electromagnetic pulse device that would kill the engine and communications simultaneously. Snatch Lily during the 30-second window when she would be most vulnerable, between leaving the park and reaching the conservatory's entrance. Use a delivery van disguised as a music equipment transport to blend into the neighborhood's commercial traffic while making their escape. The ransom demand would be modest by Billionaire standards, $8 million, an amount that Samantha Reynolds could pay without involving law enforcement agencies that might complicate the exchange. Tank's research indicated that Reynolds valued her daughter's safety more than corporate reputation, making her an ideal target for kidnappers who preferred quick transactions over prolonged negotiations. What Tank hadn't accounted for was David Miller's Tuesday routine of walking through Pioneer Park after completing his morning job search, a ritual that helped clear his mind before picking up Jake from school. David had discovered the park during his first week of unemployment, drawn by its combination of natural beauty and free Wi-Fi that allowed him to continue applying for jobs while Jake played on the elaborate playground equipment that their neighborhood couldn't afford. David was sitting on his usual bench, laptop balanced on his knees while he researched aerospace companies in Seattle, when he noticed the unusual activity around the park's main entrance. A van marked Harmony Music Transport had been parked in the same spot for nearly an hour, its engine running despite the driver's absence. 2 men in casual clothing were positioned at different points along the walking path, their attention focused on the school-aged children who passed through the area every afternoon. Years of living in Denver had taught David to recognize the subtle signs of criminal preparation, the studied casualness that masked intense focus, the positioning that suggested coordination rather than coincidence, the excessive attention to escape routes that indicated planning rather than spontaneous presence. His engineering mind automatically began analyzing the pattern, recognizing the systematic nature of what he was observing. When Lily Reynolds appeared at the park's eastern entrance, David immediately understood that he was witnessing the prelude to a kidnapping. The 11-year-old girl moved with the confident stride of someone who'd never experienced genuine danger, her piano case swinging casually as she followed the path toward the conservatory. Behind her, at a distance of approximately 40 yards, 2 security guards maintained what they believed was discreet surveillance. David watched Tank emerge from behind the equipment van, his movement coordinated with his partner's approach from the opposite direction. The security guards were focused on potential threats from ahead, not from the flanking positions that Tank had selected for exactly this tactical advantage. In approximately 20 seconds, Lily would reach the point where the park's tree cover would obscure the sight lines from multiple directions simultaneously. David's decision required no conscious deliberation. He closed his laptop, set it carefully on the bench, and began moving toward the interception point with the focused determination that had once made him exceptional at solving complex engineering problems. His mind calculated distances, timing, and angles with the precision that came from years of analyzing systems under pressure. The electromagnetic pulse device that Tank's associate triggered worked exactly as planned, causing the security detail's vehicle to lose power and communications simultaneously. The 2 guards immediately began reaching for backup radios while moving toward Lily's position, but they were still 30 yards away when Tank made his approach. "Lily Reynolds," Tank said, his voice carrying the calm authority that made children comply before they understood the danger. "Your mother sent me to pick you up. There's been a change in schedule." David arrived at the conversation just as Lily was beginning to question Tank's story. The girl was intelligent enough to recognize that something felt wrong, but not experienced enough to understand the full nature of the threat she was facing. "Excuse me," David said, inserting himself into the situation with the kind of confident interruption that suggested official authority. "Are you Ms. Reynolds, new driver? I'm David from the conservatory's security office. We need to verify your credentials before the student can leave with you." Tank's eyes narrowed as he assessed this unexpected complication. David was clearly not part of any security protocol he'd researched, but his presence and manner suggested some kind of official involvement. The success of his plan depended on completing the snatch before witnesses could intervene or authorities could respond. The family didn't mention additional security verification, quote. Tank replied, his hand moving slightly toward the concealed weapon that David's trained observation had already detected. "We're running late for an important appointment." "I understand the urgency," David said, stepping closer to Lily while maintaining eye contact with Tank. "But our new protocols require confirmation for any transportation changes. It'll just take 30 seconds to verify with Ms. Reynolds' office." David was buying time while simultaneously assessing Tank's capabilities and looking for opportunities to protect Lily if the situation escalated to violence. His phone was already in his hand, fingers moving to dial 911 while maintaining the pretense of official verification. Tank's partner had moved into position behind David, recognizing that their plan was failing and that immediate action was necessary to salvage the operation. The electromagnetic pulse had given them a window of opportunity that was rapidly closing as backup security protocols activated and law enforcement response times began counting down. "There's no time for verification," Tank said, reaching directly for Lily's arm. "We're leaving now." David's response was immediate and decisive. He grabbed Lily around the waist and pulled her backward while simultaneously shouting at maximum volume to attract attention from anyone within hearing range. Tank's attempt to grab the girl instead caught David's shoulder, sending them all tumbling toward the ground in a tangle of bodies and confusion. "Kidnapping!" David screamed as they fell. "Someone call 911! Kidnapping in progress!" Tank's partner moved to assist, but David's shouts had already attracted the attention of multiple witnesses throughout the park. Parents began calling emergency services while moving their own children to safety. The security guards, despite their disabled vehicle, were running toward the commotion with weapons drawn. David rolled to shield Lily with his own body while the girl cried in terror and confusion. Tank tried to complete the snatch by force, but David's protective positioning made it impossible to grab Lily without going through him first. The window of opportunity that his plan had depended on was closing rapidly as sirens became audible in the distance. "Get off them!" Tank's partner shouted, producing a weapon that transformed the situation from kidnapping attempt to armed assault. "Everyone back away, or someone gets hurt!" David found himself lying on top of a terrified child, facing armed criminals whose carefully planned operation had become a desperate improvisation with potentially deadly consequences. His decision to intervene had saved Lily from being kidnapped, but it had also escalated the situation to a point where multiple lives were now in immediate danger. The next few seconds would determine whether David's protective instincts had saved the day or created an even worse tragedy. All around them, the peaceful afternoon in Pioneer Park had been transformed into a crisis that would soon involve police, media, and the full attention of one of Colorado's most powerful families. David had acted on pure instinct to protect a child in danger, but he had no idea that the girl he was shielding was the daughter of the woman who had rejected his job application just hours earlier. The same qualities that Phoenix Aerospace Industries had dismissed as insufficient: quick thinking, decisive action under pressure, and willingness to sacrifice personal safety for others, were now the only things standing between Lily Reynolds and a kidnapping that would have destroyed multiple lives. The police response to the attempted kidnapping was swift and overwhelming. Within 3 minutes of David's first scream, Pioneer Park was flooded with patrol cars, SWAT vehicles, and FBI agents who specialized in crimes against high-profile families. Tank and his partner had surrendered when faced with dozens of armed officers, their carefully planned operation dissolving into handcuffs and Miranda rights as news helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures. David found himself sitting in the back of an ambulance, a blanket draped around his shoulders while paramedics checked for injuries that adrenaline had masked during the confrontation. His hands were scraped from the fall, his shoulder ached where Tank had grabbed him, and his heart was still racing with the after effects of facing armed criminals in broad daylight. But he was alive, unharmed, and most importantly, Lily Reynolds was safe. Lily sat beside him in the ambulance, no longer crying, but still shaking with the trauma of nearly being kidnapped by strangers who'd known her name and schedule. The 11-year-old girl kept looking at David with a mixture of gratitude and confusion, trying to understand why a complete stranger had risked his life to protect someone he'd never met. "Why did you help me?" Lily asked finally, her voice small and uncertain. "You don't even know me." David considered the question seriously, recognizing that his answer might shape how this child understood both danger and safety for years to come. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "When someone's in trouble, you don't stop to think about whether you know them. You just do what's right." Detective Maria Santos, the lead investigator assigned to the case, approached the ambulance with a tablet and the kind of professional demeanor that came from handling high-stakes crimes involving powerful families. She'd already taken preliminary statements from witnesses, but she needed detailed information from David about how he'd recognized the threat and decided to intervene. "Mr. Miller," Detective Santos began, settling into the chair across from them, "I need to understand exactly what you observed that made you realize something was wrong. The sequence of events could be crucial for prosecuting these suspects." David walked Detective Santos through his observations step by step. The van that had been parked too long with its engine running, the 2 men positioned strategically along the walking path, the coordinated timing that suggested careful planning rather than coincidental presence. His engineering background had trained him to notice patterns and analyze systems, skills that had proven invaluable for recognizing the setup of a kidnapping attempt. "You demonstrated remarkable situational awareness," Detective Santos noted, taking detailed notes on her tablet. "Most civilians wouldn't have recognized those indicators, let alone acted on them effectively. Do you have law enforcement or security training?" "Aerospace engineering," David replied. "But you learned to analyze systems and recognize when something doesn't fit the normal pattern." These men were operating like components in a coordinated system, not like random people in a park. Detective Santos paused in her note-taking, studying David with new interest. Aerospace engineering suggested technical expertise and problem-solving abilities that went far beyond what most witnesses brought to criminal investigations. It also raised questions about what someone with those qualifications was doing unemployed and available to sit in a park on a Tuesday afternoon. Meanwhile, 4 miles away in Phoenix Tower, Samantha Reynolds was experiencing the worst crisis of her personal and professional life. The call from Lily's school had come during a board meeting about quarterly projections, transforming routine corporate business into a parent's nightmare in the space of a single sentence. "Ms. Reynolds, there's been an incident involving your daughter." Samantha had left the meeting immediately, her usual composed control dissolving into maternal panic as her driver raced through Colorado Springs traffic toward the park, where FBI agents were coordinating the largest crime scene investigation in the city's recent history. The 20-minute drive felt like hours, each traffic light a barrier between her and confirmation that Lily was safe. When Samantha arrived at Pioneer Park, she was briefed by Agent Michael Torres, the FBI specialist who'd taken charge of the investigation. The kidnappers had been arrested, Lily was physically unharmed, and the man who'd prevented the abduction was being interviewed by detectives. But Samantha's relief at her daughter's safety was complicated by growing awareness of how catastrophically the security protocols had failed. "The electromagnetic pulse device they used is military-grade equipment," Agent Torres explained as they walked toward the ambulance where Lily was being treated. "It disabled your security team's vehicle and communications simultaneously, creating a window of vulnerability that would have been impossible to prevent with conventional protection measures." Samantha's mind immediately began calculating the implications. If professional criminals with advanced technology could defeat Phoenix Aerospace's security protocols so easily, what did that say about their ability to protect other family members, key executives, or sensitive corporate assets? The kidnapping attempt represented more than just personal trauma. It was a systematic failure that could undermine confidence in the company's entire approach to risk management. "Who stopped them?" Samantha asked, her executive instincts already focusing on understanding exactly how disaster had been averted. "A man named David Miller. He was in the park when the attempt occurred and recognized what was happening before our response teams could intervene. His quick thinking and willingness to put himself at risk saved your daughter from being taken." David Miller. The name struck Samantha with sudden recognition, though she couldn't immediately place where she'd heard it before. Something about the combination of the first name and surname felt familiar, connected to recent memory in a way that suggested professional rather than personal context. When Samantha saw David sitting in the ambulance with Lily, her first impression was of someone who radiated competence despite his casual clothing and obvious exhaustion. David was speaking quietly with Detective Santos, his explanation of events precise and analytical in a way that suggested technical training. He looked like someone who was accustomed to solving complex problems under pressure, though his presence in a public park during business hours suggested unemployment or flexible scheduling. "Lily," Samantha called out, her voice breaking slightly as she approached the ambulance. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Mother and daughter embraced with the desperate intensity that came from nearly losing each other to random violence. Lily cried against Samantha's shoulder while explaining in fragmented sentences how David had appeared just when the scary men were trying to take her away, how he'd shouted for help and protected her even when the men had weapons. "This is David," Lily said, turning toward the man who'd saved her life. "He's the one who stopped them. He's really brave." Samantha turned to face David fully for the first time, extending her hand in the formal gesture that came automatically during high-stress situations. "Mr. Miller, I understand I owe you an enormous debt of gratitude. Thank you for protecting my daughter." David shook Samantha's hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested someone accustomed to corporate leadership. There was something familiar about Samantha Reynolds' face, though David couldn't place where he might have seen it before. Probably business news coverage or corporate websites during his job search research. "I'm just glad Lily is safe," David replied. Any parent would have done the same thing. But even as he spoke the words, David knew they weren't entirely true. The park had contained dozens of adults during the kidnapping attempt, but only he had recognized the threat early enough to intervene effectively. His engineering background and analytical thinking had provided advantages that conventional parenting instincts alone wouldn't have supplied. Detective Santos finished her interview and approached Samantha with a preliminary assessment of the investigation. The kidnappers were professionals who'd planned meticulously, targeted Lily specifically because of the Reynolds family's wealth and prominence, and would have succeeded if not for David's intervention. "Mr. Miller prevented what could have been a devastating crime," Detective Santos concluded. His observation skills and quick thinking were exceptional. Without his intervention, we'd be dealing with an active kidnapping situation instead of arrested suspects. Samantha listened to the detective's summary while watching David interact with Lily, noting how naturally he communicated with children and how calmly he handled the continued chaos of the crime scene investigation. There was something about David's competence and character that reminded Samantha of the kind of employee Phoenix Aerospace claimed to value. Someone who could assess complex situations quickly and take decisive action under pressure. "Mr. Miller," Samantha said, approaching David as the formal interviews concluded, "I'd like to find some way to properly thank you for what you did today. Is there anything I can do to show my appreciation?" David considered the offer carefully, recognizing that it came from genuine gratitude rather than corporate politeness. But he was also aware that accepting favors from wealthy strangers could create obligations or expectations that might complicate his life in unexpected ways. "Seeing Lily safe is thanks enough," David replied. "I'm just glad I was in the right place at the right time." What neither person knew was that their connection went deeper than this chance encounter in Pioneer Park. The man who'd saved Samantha's daughter was the same person whose job application Samantha had rejected that morning, dismissing David's qualifications without understanding the capabilities that had just saved what mattered most to her in the world. David Miller had proven his worth under the most extreme circumstances possible, demonstrating exactly the kind of analytical thinking, quick decision-making, and personal courage that Phoenix Aerospace Industries needed but consistently failed to recognize in their hiring practices. The irony was about to become even more complex as both individuals returned to their separate lives, unaware that fate had connected them in ways that would soon challenge everything they believed about qualifications, character, and the arbitrary barriers that separated people who could benefit enormously from working together. The revelation came 4 days after the kidnapping attempt, delivered through the kind of investigative journalism that thrived on exposing connections between public events and private decisions. Jennifer Walsh, the business reporter for Colorado Tech Tribune, had been researching a broader story about corporate hiring practices when she stumbled upon a detail that transformed a heroic rescue into a much more complex narrative. David Miller, the man being hailed as a hero for preventing the Reynolds kidnapping, had applied for an engineering position at Phoenix Aerospace Industries just 5 days before the incident. His application had been personally reviewed and rejected by Samantha Reynolds herself, dismissed as unsuitable for corporate standards despite qualifications that included 7 years of aerospace engineering experience. The story broke on Saturday morning with a headline designed for maximum impact: "Rejected applicant saves CEO's daughter, the irony that's rocking Colorado Springs." Jennifer Walsh had done her homework, obtaining copies of David's application materials through sources within Phoenix's HR department, and contrasting them with the technical expertise David had demonstrated during the kidnapping prevention. Samantha Reynolds was in her home office reviewing quarterly projections when her assistant Marcus burst in with a tablet displaying the Tribune article. The color had drained from Marcus's face as he handed over the device, clearly understanding the implications of what the story revealed. "Ms. Reynolds," Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled, "there's something you need to see immediately." Samantha read the article twice, each repetition driving the implications deeper into her consciousness. The man who'd saved Lily's life was someone she'd dismissed without consideration, reducing 7 years of innovative engineering work to a single phrase in her mental evaluation: employment gap, unsuitable for corporate standards. The irony was devastating on multiple levels. David Miller possessed exactly the kind of analytical thinking and quick decision-making that Phoenix Aerospace claimed to value in their engineering teams. His ability to recognize patterns, assess threats, and take decisive action under pressure had been demonstrated under the most extreme circumstances possible. Yet Samantha had rejected his application based on surface-level judgments about employment continuity and corporate conformity. "Get David Miller's contact information," Samantha told Marcus, her voice tight with emotions she wasn't prepared to identify. "I need to speak with him immediately." "About the media coverage?" "About offering him a position." Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly, but he'd worked for Samantha long enough to recognize when his boss had made a decision that wouldn't be questioned or delayed. "I'll have his number within the hour." Meanwhile, across the city in Denver, David was experiencing his own crisis of comprehension as neighbors, friends, and strangers began calling to tell him about the Tribune article. He'd known that some media coverage was inevitable after preventing a high-profile kidnapping, but he'd assumed the focus would remain on the criminal investigation rather than his personal circumstances. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on David's door at 8:15 a.m., carrying a printed copy of the article and wearing an expression of amazement mixed with outrage. "David, did you know this company rejected your application?" David read the article with growing horror, recognizing quotes from his cover letter and details about his employment history that could only have come from inside Phoenix Aerospace Industries. Someone had leaked his application materials to create a narrative about systemic hiring failures and corporate hypocrisy. "This is why you couldn't get work?" Mrs. Rodriguez continued, her voice rising with indignation. "These people thought you weren't good enough to work for them, but you were good enough to save their daughter's life?" The phone began ringing before David could fully process the implications. Reporters wanting interviews, job recruiters who'd seen the story, neighbors expressing support, and complete strangers offering opinions about corporate hiring practices. David let the calls go to voicemail, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and uncertain about how to respond to questions about his unemployment and rejection experiences. Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in his pajamas but clearly aware that something significant was happening. At 9 years old, he was beginning to understand the complexities of adult situations, particularly those involving work and money that affected their family directly. "Dad, are you famous now?" Jake asked, studying David's expression for clues about whether this development was positive or concerning. "I don't know, buddy," David replied honestly. "Some newspaper wrote a story about what happened in the park, and now people are interested in things that are really our private business." Jake nodded with the solemn understanding of a child who'd learned that adult problems rarely had simple solutions. "Are you in trouble for helping that girl?" "No, I'm not in trouble, but sometimes when newspapers write stories, things get complicated in ways you don't expect." The complications began immediately. David's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number with a 719 area code, Colorado Springs. He almost let it go to voicemail like the others, but something about the timing suggested it might be important. "Mr. Miller, this is Marcus Chen, assistant to Samantha Reynolds at Phoenix Aerospace Industries. Ms. Reynolds would like to speak with you about a potential employment opportunity. Would you be available for a meeting this afternoon?" David felt his stomach drop. The timing was too convenient, too obviously connected to the media coverage, for this to be a genuine job offer based on his qualifications. "Mr. Chen, I appreciate the call, but I assume this is related to the newspaper article rather than my engineering background. Ms. Reynolds specifically requested this meeting after reviewing your application materials in detail. She believes there may have been an error in the initial evaluation process." An error. The euphemism was polite but transparent. Samantha Reynolds had been forced to acknowledge that rejecting David's application looked terrible in light of subsequent events. This wasn't about recognizing his qualifications, it was about damage control and corporate image management. "I need time to consider this," David said carefully. "Can I call you back?" "Of course. But Ms. Reynolds asked me to emphasize that this opportunity is based on your technical qualifications, not on recent events. She's prepared to discuss specific engineering projects where your expertise would be valuable." After hanging up, David sat in his kitchen and tried to process what was happening. 4 days ago, he'd been unemployed and facing financial crisis. Now he was being offered a job interview at the same company that had rejected his application, by the same woman whose daughter he'd saved from kidnapping. The ethical implications were complex. Accepting the position could be seen as exploiting the rescue for personal gain, validating critics who might suggest he'd helped Lily Reynolds with ulterior motives. But refusing it would mean continuing to struggle financially while making a principled stand that wouldn't pay Jake's medical bills or provide health insurance. David called his brother Michael, the only person whose advice he trusted completely on matters involving both practical considerations and moral principles. Michael lived in San Diego with his own family, but they spoke regularly about the challenges of single parenthood and career rebuilding. "So let me understand this," Michael said after David explained the situation. "The same company that said you weren't qualified enough to hire wants to give you a job now that you're famous for saving their boss's daughter." "That's essentially correct. And you're questioning whether to take the meeting because you think it might compromise your integrity. It feels like charity, or guilt, or damage control. I want to be hired because I'm good at engineering, not because I happen to be in the right place at the right time." Michael was quiet for a moment, considering the complexities his brother was facing. "David, you've been unemployed for 4 months. You have a son who needs medical care and a future that requires financial stability. If this company is finally willing to recognize your abilities, does it really matter what made them pay attention?" "It matters to me." "Why? Because you'd rather be poor and principled than employed and conflicted?" The question hit David harder than he'd expected. Was he letting pride interfere with practical necessity? Jake's therapy appointments were expensive, their savings were almost exhausted, and winter was approaching with heating bills they could barely afford. Could he really turn down a legitimate job opportunity because of concerns about how it was offered? "What if I take the meeting and it's obvious they're just offering me charity?" David asked. "Then you decline politely and continue looking for work elsewhere. But what if it's a real job offer, based on real qualifications that they should have recognized months ago?" David spent the rest of the morning researching Phoenix Aerospace Industries, current projects, reading about their engineering challenges and technical requirements. Despite everything, he found himself genuinely interested in the work they were doing: orbital communication systems, navigation software, aerospace engineering problems that would utilize exactly the skills he'd been developing for 7 years. When he called Marcus Chen back that afternoon, David had made his decision based on practical considerations rather than emotional reactions. "I'd like to schedule the meeting for Monday morning. But I want to be clear that I'm interested in discussing engineering positions, not publicity opportunities." "Ms. Reynolds will be pleased to hear that. She's looking forward to meeting with you properly." David hung up the phone and immediately began preparing for what might be the most important job interview of his career, and potentially the most complicated one. He would be walking into Phoenix Tower not as an anonymous applicant, but as the man who'd saved the CEO's daughter, creating dynamics that neither corporate training nor engineering school had prepared him to navigate. The weekend ahead would be spent researching technical questions, preparing portfolio materials, and trying to separate his genuine interest in aerospace engineering from the extraordinary circumstances that had created this opportunity. David Miller was about to discover whether his skills were truly valued or whether he was being offered a position based on gratitude rather than qualifications. The difference would determine not just his immediate employment prospects, but his long-term professional credibility and personal integrity. Monday morning would reveal whether Phoenix Aerospace Industries was ready to recognize talent they'd previously dismissed, or whether this meeting was simply an elaborate form of damage control disguised as an employment opportunity. David arrived at Phoenix Tower 15 minutes early, wearing his only professional suit and carrying a leather portfolio that contained updated technical samples, project documentation, and the kind of engineering work that he hoped would demonstrate his capabilities beyond the circumstances that had brought him to this meeting. The lobby was even more impressive than he'd expected. Soaring glass ceilings, digital displays showcasing satellite imagery and aerospace achievements, and the subtle hum of technology that suggested serious engineering work happening in the floors above. The security checkpoint was thorough, but efficient, designed to screen visitors without creating the impression of paranoia that might discourage potential clients or partners. David noticed the sophisticated badge system, biometric scanners, and discrete security cameras that suggested Phoenix had upgraded their protocols significantly since the kidnapping attempt. He was issued a temporary access card and directed to executive elevators that required keycard authorization for floors above the 25th level. During the ride to the 36th floor, David reviewed his strategy for the meeting. He would focus exclusively on technical capabilities and project experience, avoiding any reference to the rescue unless Samantha Reynolds brought it up directly. His goal was to prove that he deserved consideration based on engineering expertise, not heroic actions or media attention. Samantha's assistant Marcus greeted him at the elevator with professional warmth and guided him through corridors lined with photographs of satellite launches, engineering achievements, and corporate milestones that spoke to Phoenix's reputation in the aerospace industry. David found himself genuinely impressed by the scope of projects the company had completed, from military navigation systems to commercial orbital platforms. "Ms. Reynolds is finishing a call with our Washington office," Marcus explained as they approached the executive suite. "She asked me to show you our current project displays while you wait. She thought you might be interested in the technical challenges we're working on." The conference room adjacent to Samantha's office contained wall-mounted monitors displaying real-time data from 4 active orbital projects. David studied the system architectures with growing fascination, recognizing integration problems that he'd encountered in similar contexts during his work at Rocky Mountain Defense Systems. The displays showed exactly the kind of complex engineering challenges that made aerospace work intellectually rewarding. The synchronization issues on the communication array look familiar, David commented, pointing to diagnostic readings that indicated timing conflicts between orbital components. We had similar problems with military navigation systems when different subsystems were operating on incompatible clock frequencies. Marcus looked up from his tablet with interest. You can diagnose problems from the monitoring displays? Pattern recognition, David replied, studying the data more carefully. When you've worked with enough distributed systems, you start to recognize the signatures of common failure modes. This looks like a timing issue that's causing intermittent communication drops. Samantha Reynolds entered the conference room as David was explaining his analysis of the orbital data, carrying coffee and wearing the kind of tailored business attire that suggested serious corporate authority. She listened quietly as David described potential solutions to the synchronization problems, noting the precision and confidence with which David approached technical challenges. Mr. Miller, Samantha said, extending her hand in greeting, thank you for coming. I see you've been reviewing our current projects. They're fascinating work, David replied honestly. The integration challenges remind me of problems I solved at Rocky Mountain Defense, though the scale here is obviously much larger. Samantha gestured toward the conference table where she'd arranged David's application materials alongside technical specifications for several open engineering positions. I want to begin by apologizing for the way your initial application was handled. After reviewing your background more carefully, it's clear that we made an error in our evaluation process. David appreciated the directness but remained cautious about the timing. I understand that recent events may have prompted a review of hiring decisions. Recent events reminded me that qualifications can't always be measured by conventional metrics, Samantha replied. But this meeting is about your technical capabilities, not about what happened in the park. To prove her point, Samantha opened David's portfolio and began asking detailed questions about specific projects David had completed at Rocky Mountain Defense Systems. How had he solved integration problems between legacy military systems and modern communication networks? What approaches had he developed for troubleshooting orbital communication failures? How did he handle debugging distributed systems with multiple points of potential failure? David found himself relaxing as the conversation shifted into technical territory where he felt completely confident. He described his work on navigation software that had to integrate with aircraft systems from multiple manufacturers, his development of diagnostic protocols for satellite communication arrays, and his experience with the kind of real-time problem-solving that kept military systems operational under challenging conditions. The key insight, David explained, warming to a technical discussion about system integration, is that most failures in distributed systems aren't caused by individual component problems. They're caused by interaction effects between components that work perfectly in isolation but create conflicts when they're integrated into larger networks. Samantha took notes as David described his troubleshooting methodologies, impressed by the systematic approach David brought to complex technical problems. This was exactly the kind of analytical thinking that Phoenix's engineering teams needed, the ability to see patterns across complex systems and develop solutions that addressed root causes rather than symptoms. We're currently struggling with exactly these kinds of integration issues on our commercial orbital project, Samantha said, pulling up technical specifications on her laptop. 3 different subsystems that function perfectly in testing but create intermittent communication failures when they're deployed in the actual orbital environment. David studied the project specifications with the intense focus he brought to engineering puzzles. The problem was indeed familiar. Multiple subsystems operating on slightly different timing protocols, creating synchronization conflicts that appeared randomly but followed predictable patterns once you understood the underlying mathematics. This is a phase-locked loop problem, David said after several minutes of analysis. The subsystems are trying to synchronize with each other, but they're using different reference frequencies. You're getting interference patterns that create communication windows and dead zones. Samantha leaned forward with interest. Our engineering team has been working on this for 8 weeks. What would your approach be? David sketched a solution on the whiteboard, diagramming how the subsystems could be reconfigured to use a common timing reference that would eliminate the synchronization conflicts. His explanation was clear, technically sophisticated, and demonstrated exactly the kind of innovative thinking that Phoenix claimed to value in their engineering staff. The elegant part of this solution, David continued, is that it doesn't require replacing any existing components. You're just adding a timing coordination layer that manages the interaction between subsystems. Samantha studied David's diagram, recognizing immediately that this approach could solve a problem that had been delaying their orbital deployment by months. How long would implementation take? Depends on your development environment and testing protocols, but the core programming changes could probably be completed in 3 weeks, with another month for comprehensive testing and validation. The technical discussion continued for another hour, covering David's experience with various programming languages, his familiarity with industry-standard testing protocols, and his approach to managing complex engineering projects with tight deadlines. Samantha found herself genuinely impressed not just by David's technical knowledge, but by his ability to communicate complex concepts clearly and his systematic approach to problem-solving. "Mr. Miller," Samantha said finally, "I'd like to offer you a position as Senior Systems Integration Engineer, starting at a salary of $152,000 annually with full benefits. Your primary responsibility would be troubleshooting integration problems across our orbital communication projects." David felt his heart skip as the number registered. It was more money than he'd ever earned, enough to provide financial security for him and Jake while doing work that would utilize his skills completely. But he needed to be certain that the offer was based on his qualifications rather than circumstances. "Ms. Reynolds," David said carefully, "I want to be completely clear about something. I helped your daughter because it was the right thing to do, not because I was looking for employment opportunities. If this offer is based on gratitude rather than qualifications, I'd prefer to continue looking for positions elsewhere." Samantha met David's eyes directly, appreciating both the integrity of the question and the confidence it demonstrated. "Mr. Miller, I've been running engineering projects for 14 years. I don't offer positions to people unless I'm confident they can do the work effectively. Your analysis of our orbital integration problems was more insightful than anything our current team has produced in 8 weeks of effort." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The circumstances that brought us together were unusual, but this offer is based entirely on your technical capabilities. Phoenix Aerospace needs engineers who can solve complex problems under pressure, and you've demonstrated exactly those abilities." David studied Samantha's expression, looking for signs of corporate politeness or obligation. What he saw instead was the focused intensity of someone who understood technical excellence and was offering genuine professional opportunity. "I accept," David said, extending his hand to seal the agreement. As they shook hands, both individuals understood that they were beginning a professional relationship that had emerged from extraordinary circumstances but would be sustained by mutual respect and shared commitment to engineering excellence. David's expertise had finally been recognized by someone who could provide the opportunity to apply it, while Samantha had gained an engineer whose capabilities had been proven under the most demanding conditions possible. The irony of their initial interaction, rejection followed by rescue followed by recognition, would become part of Phoenix Aerospace's corporate culture, a reminder that talent could be found in unexpected places and that conventional hiring practices sometimes overlooked exactly the qualifications they claimed to seek. David Miller was about to begin the most challenging and rewarding work of his engineering career, while Samantha Reynolds was about to discover that her best hiring decision had almost been her biggest mistake. The media storm began building 3 weeks after David started work at Phoenix Aerospace Industries, triggered by a business journalist's investigation into corporate hiring practices in Colorado's aerospace sector. Thomas Wright, senior reporter for Rocky Mountain Business Weekly, had been researching a broader story about employment discrimination when he discovered the connection between David's rejected application and his subsequent hiring following the rescue of Samantha Reynolds' daughter. Wright's article, published on a Tuesday morning with the headline "From Rejection to Rescue to Reward, the David Miller Hiring Controversy," presented a timeline that made the sequence of events appear calculated rather than coincidental. The piece suggested that Phoenix Aerospace Industries had violated their own hiring protocols by offering David a position based on personal circumstances rather than professional qualifications, potentially creating legal liability and setting dangerous precedents for future employment decisions. The article included quotes from unnamed sources within Phoenix's engineering department who questioned whether David's rapid promotion to Senior Systems Integration Engineer was justified by his actual capabilities or influenced by the publicity surrounding the kidnapping prevention. He went from unemployed to a $152,000 salary in 4 weeks. One engineer was quoted as saying, "Either our hiring process is completely broken, or someone's getting special treatment because they happened to be in the right place at the right time. More damaging were the comments from corporate governance experts who suggested that Phoenix's hiring decision could expose the company to discrimination lawsuits from other qualified candidates who'd been rejected through normal channels. Dr. Patricia Hamilton, a business ethics professor at University of Colorado, was quoted extensively about the problems with hiring practices that appeared to favor personal connections over professional credentials. When companies make employment decisions based on factors unrelated to job performance, Dr. Hamilton stated in the article, they create liability issues and undermine confidence in their commitment to fair hiring practices. Mr. Miller may be perfectly qualified for his position, but the circumstances of his hiring raise serious questions about Phoenix Aerospace's employment standards. David first learned about the article when his phone started buzzing with calls from reporters seeking comment about the hiring controversy at 6:15 a.m. He was preparing Jake's breakfast when the first call came, followed by messages from colleagues, neighbors, and strangers who'd somehow obtained his contact information. By the time David arrived at Phoenix Tower that morning, a small group of protesters had gathered outside the building with signs reading "Fair Hiring for All" and "End Corporate Nepotism." The demonstration was modest, perhaps 30 people organized by a workers' rights group, but the presence of news cameras gave it significance beyond its actual size. David entered through the employee parking garage to avoid the protesters' immediate attention, but he could feel the tension in Phoenix's offices immediately. Conversations stopped when he walked through the engineering department. Colleagues offered polite but strained greetings, and he noticed the kind of careful distance that suggested people were unsure about how to interact with someone who'd become the center of corporate controversy. Dr. James Chen, Phoenix's chief technology officer, called David into his office an hour after he arrived. Chen was a respected engineer with 18 years of experience managing technical teams, and David had been looking forward to working with him on the orbital integration projects that had brought him to Phoenix. "David," Dr. Chen began, his tone carefully neutral, "I wanted to discuss the media attention and how it might affect your work here. The board of directors has some concerns about the publicity surrounding your hiring." David felt his stomach tighten. 3 weeks of productive engineering work, successful project contributions, and positive feedback from colleagues was apparently being overshadowed by speculation about the circumstances of his employment. "Dr. Chen, my work speaks for itself," David replied. "The orbital integration problems I've solved are saving the company months of development time and potentially millions in deployment delays." "I agree completely," Chen said quickly. "Your technical contributions have been exceptional. The synchronization solution you developed for the commercial orbital project was brilliant work that our team hadn't been able to achieve." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation he'd been directed to have. "But the board is concerned about the appearance of impropriety. They're worried that the media coverage could damage Phoenix's reputation and create legal complications." David understood immediately what Chen was really saying. The board wanted him to resign quietly, probably with a generous severance package, to make the controversy disappear before it affected Phoenix's corporate image or stock price. "Are you asking me to resign?" David asked directly. "I'm asking you to consider whether continuing in your current position is in everyone's best interests," Chen replied diplomatically. "The board is prepared to offer a very generous separation package that would provide financial security while allowing you to pursue opportunities elsewhere." David sat back in his chair, processing the implications of what was being suggested. 3 weeks of proving his technical capabilities meant nothing compared to the media narrative that painted his hiring as corporate favoritism. The same expertise that had solved engineering problems at Phoenix was being overshadowed by speculation about his motivations for helping a child in danger. "Dr. Chen, are you satisfied with my technical performance?" "Absolutely. You're one of the most capable systems engineers I've worked with." "Are there any concerns about my ability to handle current or future projects?" "None whatsoever. Your work has exceeded our expectations." "Then why are we having this conversation?" Chen looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing the unfairness of the situation while understanding his responsibility to communicate the board's concerns. "Because sometimes perception matters as much as performance in corporate environments. The board believes that your continued employment could become a distraction that affects team morale and public confidence." David felt anger building, not just at the injustice of the situation but at the cowardice of a corporate system that was willing to sacrifice competent employees to avoid negative publicity. He'd worked for 3 weeks to prove that his hiring was justified by his abilities, only to discover that his abilities were irrelevant compared to media narratives and board politics. "What kind of separation package?" David asked, though asking the question felt like accepting defeat. 8 months, salary, continuation of health benefits, and positive references for future employment. The board recognizes that this situation isn't your fault and wants to ensure you're not penalized financially. David considered the offer from multiple angles. 8 months, salary would provide financial security for him and Jake, allowing him to conduct a proper job search without the pressure of immediate income needs. Health benefits would cover Jake's continued therapy and medical care. Positive references would help overcome the potential negative impact of a brief tenure at Phoenix. But accepting the package would also validate the media narrative that his hiring had been inappropriate, making it difficult to explain his departure to future employers. More importantly, it would mean surrendering to a system that consistently undervalued technical expertise when it conflicted with corporate image management. "I need time to consider this," David said finally. "Of course, but I should mention that the board wants a decision by Friday. The longer this controversy continues, the more difficult it becomes for everyone involved." David left Chen's office feeling like he was reliving the employment rejections that had defined his job search 4 months earlier. The same corporate systems that had dismissed his qualifications were now prepared to dismiss his contributions because his hiring had attracted unwanted attention. He spent the rest of the day working on orbital integration problems, trying to focus on technical challenges, while processing the emotional impact of being told that his professional competence was less important than public relations concerns. His colleagues maintained polite distance, uncertain about how to interact with someone who might be leaving under controversial circumstances. At lunch, David sat alone in Phoenix's cafeteria, reviewing the morning's events and trying to decide how to respond to the board's ultimatum. Through the windows, he could see the protesters still gathered outside the building, their signs demanding fair hiring practices that ironically threatened to end his own employment. His phone buzzed with a text from Jake's school counselor. "David, can we schedule a meeting about Jake's adjustment to the changes in your work situation? He seems anxious about stability." Even Jake was being affected by the controversy, worried about whether his father's new job would disappear as suddenly as it had appeared. David realized that his decision wouldn't just affect his own career, but would send a message about whether technical expertise could survive corporate politics, whether competence could overcome perception, and whether individuals could stand up to institutional pressure when principles were at stake. The choice he made by Friday would determine not just his immediate employment but his long-term credibility as an engineer and his ability to provide the stability that Jake needed. He was facing the same kind of systematic prejudice that had led to his initial rejection, disguised now as concern about corporate reputation rather than employment gaps. David Miller had proven his technical worth beyond any reasonable doubt, but he was about to discover that in corporate America, being right wasn't always enough to survive being controversial. The emergency board meeting was called for Thursday morning, 24 hours before David's deadline to accept the separation package. Samantha Reynolds arrived at Phoenix Tower to find the parking lot still occupied by protesters, whose numbers had grown to nearly 60 people, their chants about fair hiring practices echoing off the glass facade of the building she'd inherited from her father. Inside the 37th floor boardroom, the atmosphere was tense with the kind of corporate anxiety that emerged when media attention threatened quarterly projections and shareholder confidence. The board members had assembled with the grim determination of executives preparing to sacrifice an individual employee to protect institutional interests. Harold Blackstone, Phoenix's longest-serving board member and the man who'd worked with Samantha's father to build the company from a small engineering firm into an aerospace giant, sat at the head of the mahogany conference table with folders containing media coverage, legal assessments, and financial projections related to the David Miller controversy. "Samantha," Blackstone began without preamble, "this situation has escalated beyond what any of us anticipated. Our legal department has identified potential liability issues. Our PR firm is recommending immediate damage control, and our stock price has dropped 2% since the Rocky Mountain Business Weekly article was published." Samantha took her seat at the opposite end of the table, facing 7 board members who collectively controlled enough shares to override her decisions if they chose to act in concert. She'd spent the previous evening reviewing David's technical contributions, preparing documentation that proved her hiring decision had been based on engineering capabilities rather than personal circumstances. "Harold, before we discuss damage control, I want to review David Miller's actual performance," Samantha replied, opening a portfolio containing project reports, technical analyses, and peer evaluations from Phoenix's engineering staff. His contributions over the past 3 weeks have been exceptional. Margaret Torres, the board member who chaired Phoenix's audit committee, interrupted before Samantha could present her documentation. Samantha, the quality of his work isn't the issue. The issue is the appearance that we've compromised our hiring standards for personal reasons. The appearance created by media speculation rather than factual analysis, Samantha countered. David solved orbital integration problems in 3 weeks that our engineering team hadn't been able to resolve in 8 months. His synchronization protocols are saving us potentially millions in deployment delays. That may be true, said David Kim, the newest board member and a former executive at a major defense contractor. But perception drives market confidence, and market confidence drives shareholder value. We can't afford to appear as though we make personnel decisions based on emotional rather than professional considerations. Samantha studied the faces around the conference table, recognizing the combination of genuine concern and corporate cowardice that led intelligent people to make decisions based on avoiding criticism rather than maximizing results. These were experienced executives who understood that public relations problems could damage company reputation regardless of underlying facts. "What exactly are you proposing?" Samantha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Blackstone opened his folder and removed a document that looked like a legal agreement. "We're prepared to offer Mr. Miller a separation package worth 18 months, salary, continued health benefits, and positive references that will help him secure employment elsewhere. This resolves the controversy while ensuring he's not financially penalized for circumstances beyond his control." You want to fire someone whose technical performance has exceeded every measurable standard because journalists are speculating about his hiring? "We want to protect Phoenix Aerospace from liability and reputation damage," Torres replied. "Mr. Miller is undoubtedly qualified, but his continued employment has become a distraction that affects team morale and public confidence." Samantha felt the familiar frustration of dealing with corporate systems that prioritized perception over performance, image over innovation. This was exactly the kind of thinking that had led to David's initial rejection, the assumption that conventional metrics mattered more than actual capabilities. "Have any of you actually spoken with David about his work?" Samantha asked. "Have you reviewed the technical solutions he's developed or discussed his contributions with our engineering teams?" "Samantha," Kim said, his tone suggesting patient explanation of obvious facts, "this isn't about his technical qualifications. It's about corporate governance and risk management. When we make hiring decisions that appear to be influenced by personal relationships, we create precedents that could expose us to discrimination lawsuits from other qualified candidates." "What personal relationship?" Samantha demanded. "I had never met David Miller before he prevented my daughter from being kidnapped. His hiring was based entirely on his ability to solve engineering problems that our existing team couldn't handle." The room fell quiet as board members exchanged glances that suggested they'd already reached consensus before the meeting began. Samantha realized she was facing not a discussion but an ultimatum disguised as corporate consultation. "Samantha," Blackstone said finally, "the board has voted 6-1 in favor of offering Mr. Miller the separation package. We need your agreement to implement this decision by tomorrow's deadline. And if I refuse?" The silence that followed her question was more revealing than any direct answer. Samantha understood that her authority as CEO was being tested, that the board was prepared to challenge her leadership if she continued to support an employee whose presence had become politically inconvenient. "We hope that won't be necessary," Torres said diplomatically. "We believe that resolving this situation quickly and quietly is in everyone's best interests, including Mr. Miller's." Samantha stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the protesters still gathered in the parking lot below. Their signs demanding fair hiring practices created an ironic backdrop for a conversation about sacrificing a qualified employee to corporate politics. "I need time to consider this," Samantha said, though she'd already made her decision. "Can we reconvene tomorrow morning?" "Of course," Blackstone replied. "But I want to emphasize that delay increases our exposure to negative publicity and potential legal complications." After the board members filed out of the conference room, Samantha remained at the window, watching the protesters and thinking about the letter her father had written to her when she'd inherited control of Phoenix Aerospace Industries. "The most important decisions you'll make," he'd written, "won't be about technology or markets or profits. They'll be about what kind of company you want to lead and what kind of leader you want to be. Charles Reynolds had built Phoenix by recognizing talent wherever he found it, promoting engineers based on results rather than credentials, and maintaining that character mattered more than conventional qualifications. He'd told Samantha countless times that the company's success depended on hiring the best people available, regardless of whether they fit traditional corporate profiles. Now, Samantha faced a choice between honoring that legacy and accepting the board's demand to sacrifice David to protect Phoenix's corporate image. The decision would define not just David's future, but Samantha's own identity as a leader, and the kind of company Phoenix would become under her direction. Samantha called David's extension, requesting a meeting that afternoon to discuss the board's decision and explore options for responding to the institutional pressure they were both facing. The conversation would determine whether they would stand together against corporate politics, or whether David would become another casualty of systems that valued perception over performance. 2 hours later, Samantha found herself in the unusual position of asking an employee to help her fight her own board of directors. The man she'd initially rejected as unqualified had become her strongest ally in a battle for the soul of the company her father had built on principles of recognizing talent regardless of conventional expectations. David Miller was about to discover that sometimes the most important fights weren't about individual employment, but about whether courage and competence could triumph over corporate cowardice and institutional prejudice. The decision he made would affect not just his own career but the future direction of a company that claimed to value innovation while consistently punishing those who challenged conventional thinking. David arrived at Samantha's office that afternoon carrying a folder containing his resignation letter, already drafted and awaiting only his signature. He'd spent the previous night calculating the financial benefits of accepting the separation package against the long-term costs of being seen as someone who'd been forced out of a position due to controversy, rather than performance issues. The mathematics of survival were compelling. 18 months, salary would provide unprecedented financial security for him and Jake, enough to cover medical expenses, housing costs, and living expenses while conducting a thorough job search. The positive references would help explain his brief tenure at Phoenix in ways that wouldn't damage his professional reputation with future employers. But accepting the package would also mean surrendering to the same systemic prejudices that had led to his initial rejection, validating the narrative that his hiring had been inappropriate regardless of his actual contributions. More importantly, it would mean abandoning work that utilized his skills completely and provided the intellectual satisfaction he'd been seeking throughout 4 months of unemployment. Samantha gestured for David to sit at the small conference table in her office, rather than across the imposing desk that reinforced hierarchical relationships. She'd arranged coffee and notebooks, suggesting a collaborative discussion rather than a formal termination meeting. "David," Samantha began, "I want you to understand that the board's decision doesn't reflect any concerns about your technical performance or professional capabilities. Your work has exceeded every expectation we had when we hired you. But my continued employment has become a liability that outweighs my contributions," David replied, completing the thought that Samantha was diplomatically avoiding. "I understand the board's position, and I've prepared my resignation to make this situation easier for everyone." David placed the resignation letter on the table between them, the document representing both practical acceptance of corporate realities and personal acknowledgement that individual competence wasn't always sufficient to overcome institutional politics. Samantha studied the letter without picking it up, recognizing that David's willingness to resign voluntarily would solve the board's immediate concerns while protecting Phoenix from the appearance of firing someone whose hiring had attracted negative publicity. "Before you make a final decision," Samantha said, "I want you to understand something about Phoenix Aerospace and the choice we're both facing. This company was built by my father, who believed that talent should be recognized regardless of conventional credentials or corporate protocols." Samantha walked to a bookshelf and removed a framed photograph showing a much younger Charles Reynolds standing with a diverse group of engineers in front of Phoenix's first orbital launch. The image captured the excitement and innovation that had defined the company's early culture. "My father hired our first female aerospace engineer in 1989, when most companies wouldn't consider women for technical positions. He promoted our first software engineer without a college degree to chief technology officer, based purely on his ability to solve problems that stumped people with advanced degrees. He built this company by valuing results over resumes." David listened, understanding that Samantha was describing corporate values that had apparently been compromised by the board's current approach to risk management and public relations concerns. David, if I accept your resignation, I'm validating the same prejudices that led to your initial rejection. I'm telling my engineering teams that corporate image matters more than technical excellence. I'm betraying everything my father believed about recognizing talent wherever it's found. Samantha returned to her seat, her expression carrying the intensity of someone preparing to make a decision that would define her leadership and possibly her career. I don't want your resignation, Samantha continued. I want to fight the board's decision and prove that your hiring was based entirely on professional qualifications. But I can't do that without your support, and I won't ask you to risk your financial security for principles that might not survive corporate politics. David considered Samantha's proposal, recognizing that refusing to resign would mean entering a battle against institutional forces that had already demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice individual employees to protect corporate reputation. Samantha, what exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we document your technical contributions so thoroughly that the board can't credibly argue your hiring was inappropriate. I'm suggesting that we demonstrate the value you've provided to Phoenix's engineering projects in ways that make your departure obviously detrimental to company interests. Samantha opened her laptop and displayed a presentation she'd been preparing since the previous evening. The slides documented David's technical solutions, quantified the time and cost savings his work had generated, and included testimonials from engineering colleagues who'd worked with him on various projects. Your synchronization protocols for the commercial orbital project have saved us 8 months of development time and approximately $6 million in deployment delays, Samantha explained, clicking through project documentation. Your diagnostic procedures for the military navigation system identified integration problems that our team had been unable to locate for 10 weeks. David studied the presentation, impressed by the thoroughness with which Samantha had documented his contributions. The data clearly demonstrated that his hiring had provided measurable value to Phoenix's engineering capabilities, regardless of the circumstances that had brought him to the company's attention. This is compelling evidence, David said, but will it change the board's position? They seem more concerned about media perception than engineering performance. That's exactly why I need your help, Samantha replied. If you resign, they win by default. If you stay and fight, we force them to justify firing someone whose technical contributions are demonstrably valuable to the company. David understood the stakes Samantha was describing. This wasn't just about individual employment, but about whether Phoenix Aerospace would continue to value engineering excellence or sacrifice it to corporate politics and public relations concerns. Samantha, I have a son whose medical needs require stable health insurance and predictable income. If we fight the board and lose, I could end up with nothing instead of the separation package they're offering. If we fight and lose, I'll personally guarantee that you receive the separation package, plus additional compensation for the time and risk involved in challenging their decision, Samantha replied. You won't be financially penalized for standing up for principles. David appreciated the offer, but he also understood that Samantha's ability to provide such guarantees depended on her own continued authority as CEO. If the board was prepared to overrule Samantha on David's employment, they might also be prepared to challenge her leadership more broadly. What makes you think we can win this fight? Samantha closed her laptop and leaned forward with the focused intensity that had driven her success in the competitive aerospace industry. Because I have documentation proving that your hiring was based entirely on technical qualifications. Because your performance has exceeded every measurable standard. And because firing you would set a precedent that could destroy Phoenix's ability to attract innovative engineers. She paused, choosing her words carefully. David, talented engineers don't want to work for companies that sacrifice competent employees to avoid negative publicity. If we fire you for performing exceptional work, what message does that send to other potential hires? David recognized the broader implications Samantha was describing. Phoenix's reputation in the engineering community would suffer if qualified employees could be terminated based on media speculation rather than professional performance. The company's ability to recruit top talent would be compromised by the perception that job security depended on avoiding controversy rather than achieving results. If I agree to fight this, David said, what's our strategy? Samantha smiled for the first time since the conversation began, recognizing that David's question represented agreement to challenge the board's decision rather than acceptance of the resignation option. We present your technical contributions to the full board, we document the financial value you've provided to the company, and we force them to explain why they want to fire someone whose performance has been exemplary, Samantha replied. We make them choose between protecting corporate image and protecting engineering excellence. David removed his resignation letter from the table and tore it in half, the symbolic gesture representing his commitment to fighting for principles, rather than accepting the practical safety of surrender. "All right," David said, "let's prove that competence matters more than controversy." The decision committed both individuals to a battle against institutional forces that valued perception over performance, but it also created an alliance based on shared values and mutual respect that might prove stronger than corporate politics. David Miller and Samantha Reynolds were about to discover whether courage and technical excellence could overcome the systematic prejudices that consistently undervalued innovation in favor of conformity, expertise in favor of credentials, and character in favor of corporate image management. The crisis began at 2:23 a.m. on Friday morning, when Phoenix's primary orbital control center in Colorado Springs detected anomalous behavior from the company's newest commercial communications satellite. The $280 million orbital platform, launched just 7 weeks earlier, was experiencing intermittent signal losses that threatened to disrupt data transmission for 19 major telecommunications clients across North America. Dr. James Chen was awakened by the emergency notification system that alerted senior technical staff to critical system failures. The automated message indicated that the satellite's communication arrays were cycling through periods of complete signal blackout, lasting between 30 and 80 seconds, followed by brief windows of normal operation. The pattern was irregular enough to suggest multiple failure modes operating simultaneously. Chen arrived at Phoenix Tower by 4:45 a.m. to find the Emergency Operations Center already staffed with engineers who'd been working since the first alerts were triggered. The wall-mounted displays showed real-time telemetry from the malfunctioning satellite, diagnostic readings that painted a picture of systematic communication breakdown affecting multiple subsystems. "What's the status?" Chen asked Sarah Martinez, the lead systems engineer who'd been coordinating the emergency response. "We're seeing cascading failures across 4 different communication arrays," Martinez replied, pointing to diagnostic displays that showed the scope of the problem. "The primary data transmission system is experiencing intermittent shutdowns, the backup communication array is showing synchronization errors, the emergency beacon system is cycling between operational and offline status, and the tertiary redundancy system is failing to maintain stable connections." Chen studied the telemetry data with growing concern. The satellite represented 2 years of development work and the foundation of Phoenix's expansion into commercial telecommunications markets. More immediately, the communication failures were already affecting clients whose operations depended on reliable data transmission, creating potential liability issues that could cost tens of millions in penalties and lost contracts. "Have we identified the root cause?" "That's the problem," Martinez said, her frustration evident. "We're seeing symptoms that suggest multiple independent failures, but the timing patterns don't make sense. The synchronization errors are occurring at intervals that seem almost coordinated, like the systems are interfering with each other rather than failing randomly." Chen recognized the description immediately. It matched exactly the kind of integration problems that David Miller had diagnosed and solved in Phoenix's ground-based satellite systems just 2 weeks earlier. The phase-locked loop conflicts that David had identified as systematic timing coordination issues between subsystems trying to synchronize on incompatible reference frequencies. "Has anyone contacted David Miller?" Chen asked. "His expertise with satellite integration problems could be valuable here." Martinez hesitated, clearly aware of the controversies surrounding David's employment and the board's pending decision about his separation package. "Given the current situation with his employment status, we weren't sure about protocol for involving him in emergency operations." Chen understood the delicate corporate politics involved, but he also understood that a $280 million satellite failure took precedence over personnel controversies. "Get him on the phone immediately. If this is the same kind of integration problem he solved for our ground systems, he might be the only person who can diagnose the failure mode quickly enough to save the satellite." At 5:15 a.m., David was preparing Jake's breakfast when his phone rang, with Chen's call requesting immediate assistance with the satellite emergency. David had been monitoring the news about Phoenix's technical difficulties through industry websites, understanding that the commercial satellite represented a crucial project for the company's future growth. "David," Chen said, his voice tight with stress, "we're facing a critical failure in our commercial communications satellite. The symptoms match the integration problems you solved in our ground systems. Can you get here immediately? David looked at Jake, who was eating cereal while watching morning cartoons, blissfully unaware that his father was being asked to help save a $250 million piece of technology. I can be there in 50 minutes. What kind of access will I need to the satellite control systems? Full diagnostic access. I'm authorizing emergency protocols that override normal security restrictions. This is about saving the satellite, not corporate politics. David arranged for Mrs. Rodriguez to supervise Jake before school and drove to Phoenix Tower through morning traffic that seemed impossibly slow given the urgency of the situation. He arrived to find the parking lot still occupied by protesters, but their signs about fair hiring practices seemed irrelevant compared to the technical crisis unfolding 37 floors above. The Emergency Operations Center was filled with tension and controlled chaos as engineers worked to understand and address the satellite's deteriorating condition. David was briefed on the failure symptoms while being granted access to diagnostic systems that normally required weeks of security clearance to utilize. "Show me the synchronization error patterns," David said, settling at a workstation connected directly to the satellite's telemetry systems. "I need to see the timing relationships between the different communication arrays." As David studied the diagnostic data, the pattern became immediately apparent. The satellite's 4 communication subsystems were attempting to coordinate their operations using slightly different timing protocols, creating interference patterns that cascaded through the entire communication network. Each subsystem functioned perfectly when operating independently, but their attempts to synchronize with each other were creating the systematic failures that threatened the satellite's operational capability. "This is exactly what I diagnosed in your ground systems," David explained to the assembled engineers. "The communication arrays are trying to establish timing coordination, but they're using incompatible reference frequencies. Every time they attempt to synchronize, they create interference that temporarily disables all communication functions." Dr. Chen leaned over David's shoulder, studying the diagnostic displays that showed the mathematical relationships between the failing systems. "Can this be fixed remotely, or do we need to consider the satellite a total loss?" David was already sketching solutions on a whiteboard, diagramming how the satellite software could be reprogrammed to establish a master timing reference that would eliminate the synchronization conflicts. The solution was elegant but complex, requiring precise coordination between multiple programming teams and real-time testing of modifications to systems operating 22,000 miles above Earth. "We can fix this," David said with confidence, "but it requires reprogramming the timing coordination protocols for all 4 communication arrays simultaneously. The changes have to be uploaded and activated in perfect synchronization, or we could create worse failures than what we're dealing with now." Samantha Reynolds arrived at the operations center at 7:30 a.m. having been briefed on the satellite crisis and David's involvement in developing solutions. The timing was particularly significant given that the board meeting to finalize David's termination was scheduled for 9 a.m. that morning. "What's the current status?" Samantha asked, joining the group of engineers clustered around David's workstation. "David has identified the root cause and developed a repair strategy," Chen replied. "But implementation requires programming changes that are beyond our normal risk tolerance for satellite modifications." Samantha understood the implications immediately. Satellite software modifications were typically tested for months before implementation, due to the impossibility of physical repairs if remote programming changes created new problems. But the satellite was already failing, making aggressive intervention the only alternative to complete loss. "David, what's your confidence level in this solution?" David looked up from the diagnostic displays, meeting Samantha's eyes with the same steady determination he'd shown when facing armed kidnappers in Pioneer Park. "I'm completely confident in the technical analysis. The mathematical relationships are identical to what I solved in your ground systems. But satellite programming carries inherent risks that ground system repairs don't face." Meaning if we're wrong about any aspect of the timing coordination, we could lose the satellite permanently instead of losing it gradually to the current failures. Samantha studied the faces of the engineering team, recognizing that David's expertise represented their best hope for saving a satellite worth more than many people's lifetime earnings. The irony wasn't lost on her that the man the board wanted to terminate for inappropriate hiring was now their only realistic option for preventing a $250 million disaster. "Dr. Chen, what's your assessment of David's proposed solution?" Chen had worked with satellite systems for 16 years. But he'd never encountered the specific type of integration failure that David had diagnosed and solved multiple times in ground-based applications. I believe David's analysis is correct, and I believe his solution will work. But I also believe we need to move quickly before the current failures cascade into complete system shutdown. Samantha made the decision that would define not only the satellite's fate, but David's future at Phoenix Aerospace. David, you have full authorization to implement whatever programming changes are necessary to save the satellite. Dr. Chen, provide him with whatever technical support and system access he needs. David nodded and turned back to his workstation, beginning the most challenging and high-stakes engineering work of his career. Over the next 5 hours, he would either save a $250 million satellite or be responsible for its destruction, all while knowing that the board meeting to terminate his employment was proceeding 37 floors above. The ultimate test of David's expertise was about to begin, with the entire future of Phoenix's commercial satellite program hanging in the balance. The satellite repair operation took 5 hours and 32 minutes of the most intense technical work David had ever performed. Working with a team of 14 engineers, he coordinated the simultaneous reprogramming of 4 communication arrays operating 22,000 miles above Earth, each modification requiring split-second timing to prevent the cascading failures that could have destroyed the satellite permanently. David's solution required establishing a master timing reference that would synchronize all communication subsystems to a single frequency standard, eliminating the interference patterns that had been causing the systematic shutdowns. The programming changes had to be uploaded in a specific sequence, with each array's timing protocols being modified before the others attempted to establish synchronization links. Initiating upload sequence for Array Alpha, David announced to the Operations Center at 12:47 p.m., his fingers moving across multiple keyboards as he managed the complex coordination between ground control systems and satellite programming interfaces. All teams confirm ready status for synchronized activation. Dr. Chen monitored the satellite's power consumption and orbital stability, while David focused on the timing coordination protocols. Any unexpected power drain or attitude adjustment during the programming sequence could interfere with the communication array's ability to receive and implement the software modifications. Array Alpha upload complete, reported Michael Torres, the senior programmer working at David's left. System is holding at standby status, awaiting synchronization signal. Array Beta upload initiating now, David continued, watching diagnostic displays that showed the satellite's communication systems in various states of modification and coordination. The risk was enormous. If any single array failed to synchronize properly, the entire satellite could become permanently unresponsive to ground control signals. Meanwhile, 37 floors above the operations center, the board meeting to formalize David's termination had concluded with Samantha Reynolds' dramatic announcement that David was currently saving a $250 million satellite that the company's other engineers had been unable to repair. Harold Blackstone had initially dismissed Samantha's claims as desperate attempts to avoid implementing the board's decision, but phone calls to the operations center confirmed that David was indeed leading a critical repair operation that could determine Phoenix's future in commercial satellite markets. Samantha, Blackstone said, his tone carrying the grudging respect of someone forced to acknowledge uncomfortable facts, regardless of Mr. Miller's current contributions, we still have concerns about the circumstances of his hiring and the precedent it sets for our employment practices. Harold, what precedent does it set to fire someone while they're saving the company millions of dollars? Samantha replied, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd reached the limits of diplomatic patience. What message does that send to our engineering teams about the value we place on technical expertise? Margaret Torres, who'd been monitoring updates from the operations center on her tablet, looked up with an expression of surprise and concern. Samantha, I'm reading reports that this satellite failure could have cost us 19 major client contracts. Is that accurate? Completely accurate. The communication disruptions were already triggering penalty clauses that could have cost tens of millions in fees and lost business. David's repair work is preventing a catastrophe that would have affected our entire commercial satellite division. The board members exchanged glances that suggested their confidence in terminating David was being undermined by real-time evidence of his value to the company. It was difficult to justify firing someone while they were demonstrably saving the organization from financial disaster. In the operations center, David's repair work was entering its most critical phase. All 4 communication arrays had been successfully reprogrammed, but the synchronization activation required perfect timing to prevent the interference patterns from recurring. Array Gamma upload complete, David announced. Array Delta upload initiating final sequence. All arrays will be programmed and ready for synchronized activation in 90 seconds. Dr. Chen checked the satellite's vital signs one final time. Power consumption nominal, orbital attitude stable, ground control links secure. All systems green for synchronization sequence. Array Delta upload complete, Torres reported. All 4 arrays programmed and standing by for synchronized activation. David paused for a moment, understanding that the next 60 seconds would determine whether his solution worked or whether he'd be responsible for the permanent loss of Phoenix's most expensive satellite. The entire operations center fell silent as engineers prepared to witness either a brilliant technical success or a $250 million failure. Initiating synchronized activation in 10 seconds, David announced, "All arrays will attempt timing coordination simultaneously on my mark." The countdown felt like hours instead of seconds. David's hand hovered over the activation control, while diagnostic displays showed the satellite systems prepared for the most critical test of his engineering career. "Mark," David said, pressing the activation sequence that would either save the satellite or destroy it. For 53 seconds, the diagnostic displays showed chaotic activity as the 4 communication arrays attempted to establish timing coordination using David's modified protocols. Power consumption spiked as the systems worked to synchronize their operations, and several engineers held their breath as error messages flashed across monitoring screens. Then, at 1:42 p.m., all error indicators cleared simultaneously. The diagnostic displays showed perfect synchronization between all 4 communication arrays, stable power consumption, and normal operational status across every satellite subsystem. Synchronization achieved, Dr. Chen announced, his voice reflecting amazement and relief in equal measure. All communication arrays are operational and coordinated. The satellite is fully functional. The operations center erupted in applause and congratulations as engineers recognized that David had not only solved the immediate crisis, but had implemented a synchronization solution that would prevent similar failures in the future. The satellite was now more reliable than it had been before the crisis began. David slumped back in his chair, exhausted from 5 hours of high-stakes technical work, but satisfied with the results. He'd proven once again that his analytical skills and systematic approach to problem-solving could produce results that justified the confidence Samantha had shown in hiring him. "David," Dr. Chen said, approaching his workstation with an expression of professional admiration, "that was the most impressive diagnostic and repair work I've witnessed in 20 years of satellite engineering. You saved the satellite, the client contracts, and probably several people's careers." The success of David's satellite repair created immediate ripple effects throughout Phoenix Aerospace Industries. Client companies that had been preparing breach-of-contract lawsuits instead sent congratulations about the rapid resolution of technical problems. Engineering teams that had struggled with similar integration issues requested David's assistance with their projects. Industry publications began preparing articles about Phoenix's innovative approach to satellite troubleshooting. More immediately, the board members who'd been meeting to formalize David's termination found themselves in the awkward position of trying to justify firing someone who'd just saved the company from massive financial losses. Samantha Reynolds returned to the boardroom with documentation of David's satellite repair work, presenting evidence that made the termination decision appear not just unjust, but actively harmful to Phoenix's technical capabilities. "Gentlemen," Samantha said, spreading printouts of the satellite repair documentation across the conference table, "I present David Miller's performance review for today. He diagnosed and repaired a $250 million satellite that our other engineers couldn't fix, saved 19 major client contracts, and prevented penalty fees that could have cost tens of millions." Harold Blackstone studied the technical reports with the grudging recognition of someone forced to acknowledge that his assumptions had been completely wrong. "Samantha, I don't think anyone questions Mr. Miller's technical abilities. But we still have concerns about the hiring process and corporate governance issues." "Harold, what governance issues?" "David was hired because he could solve engineering problems that our existing team couldn't handle. Today he proved that assessment was absolutely correct. The room fell silent as board members struggled to reconcile their concerns about hiring practices with the undeniable evidence of David's value to the company. Margaret Torres finally spoke the question that everyone was considering. Samantha, if we terminate someone who just saved us from a major disaster, what does that say about our judgment and our commitment to technical excellence? Samantha recognized that the satellite repair had fundamentally changed the dynamics of David's employment controversy. It was no longer possible to argue that his hiring had been inappropriate when his contributions were demonstrably valuable to Phoenix's core business operations. I propose that we formally acknowledge David Miller's exceptional performance and confirm his permanent employment with Phoenix Aerospace Industries, Samantha said. His technical contributions have more than justified our hiring decision. The vote was unanimous, a complete reversal from the board's position just hours earlier. David's expertise had not only saved a satellite, but had proven that competence could overcome corporate politics when the stakes were high enough and the results were undeniable. David Miller had won the ultimate vindication, not through arguments or documentation, but through demonstrating under extreme pressure that his technical abilities were exactly what Phoenix Aerospace Industries needed to succeed in competitive aerospace markets. 20 months later, David stood in the same conference room where the board had once voted to terminate his employment, but everything had changed. The wall-mounted displays now showed real-time telemetry from 9 commercial satellites that formed the backbone of Phoenix's expanded telecommunications network, each one incorporating the synchronization protocols that David had developed during the crisis that saved his career. David wore the charcoal gray blazer that had become his signature look as Phoenix's Director of Satellite Systems Integration, a position created specifically to utilize his unique expertise in solving complex coordination problems between distributed aerospace systems. His salary had increased to $195,000 annually, providing the financial security that allowed Jake to attend the specialized STEM Academy, where his passion for engineering could flourish alongside other gifted students. The morning's agenda included presenting quarterly results to the board of directors. The same executives who had once viewed David as a liability now recognized him as one of Phoenix's most valuable technical assets. His integration protocols had become industry standard, licensed to other aerospace companies, and generating significant revenue streams beyond their original application to Phoenix's satellite networks. David, Samantha said, taking her seat at the head of the conference table, would you present the satellite division's performance metrics? David opened his laptop and displayed the quarterly report that documented Phoenix's transformation from a traditional aerospace contractor to a leading provider of commercial satellite communication services. The numbers told a remarkable story of growth, innovation, and technical excellence that had exceeded every projection made when David first joined the company. Our satellite network is currently providing communication services to 57 major clients across North America, David began, clicking through slides that showed operational statistics, revenue figures, and customer satisfaction ratings. System reliability has improved to 99.8% uptime, compared to industry averages of 97.1%. Harold Blackstone, who had once led the campaign to terminate David's employment, now listened with the respectful attention of someone who had learned to recognize exceptional performance regardless of its unconventional origins. David, what's driving the superior reliability metrics? The synchronization protocols we developed during the emergency repair have eliminated the integration failures that caused most satellite communication problems, David explained. We've also implemented predictive diagnostic systems that identify potential problems before they affect client operations. The technical innovations David had developed extended far beyond the original satellite repair. His systematic approach to preventing integration failures had revolutionized Phoenix's entire approach to designing and maintaining distributed aerospace systems, leading to breakthroughs that competitors were struggling to replicate. Margaret Torres reviewed the financial projections with obvious satisfaction. David, your division is projecting 45% revenue growth for the next fiscal year. What's driving that expansion? 3 factors, David replied, advancing to the next slide. First, we're licensing our synchronization technology to other aerospace companies, generating royalty income of approximately $18 million annually. Second, our satellite reliability has attracted new clients who were previously using competitors with less dependable services. Third, We're developing next-generation orbital platforms that will expand our technical capabilities significantly. The presentation continued for 50 minutes, covering technical achievements, financial performance, and strategic plans that positioned Phoenix as a leader in commercial satellite communications. David's transformation from rejected applicant to division director had paralleled the company's evolution from traditional defense contractor to innovative technology provider. After the board meeting concluded, David walked to his office on the 34th floor, a space that reflected both his technical focus and his personal journey. The walls displayed framed photographs of satellite launches, engineering awards, and technical diagrams alongside pictures of Jake at various science competitions and academic ceremonies. Jake, now 10 years old, had blossomed in the stable environment that David's career success had provided. His anxiety disorders had responded well to consistent therapy, made affordable by Phoenix's comprehensive health benefits, and his academic performance had flourished in specialized programs designed for students with exceptional scientific aptitude. "Dad," Jake said, appearing in David's office doorway with the confident stride of someone who felt completely comfortable in technical environments, "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you can judge the regional engineering competition next month." David smiled at his son, marveling at how much their lives had changed since the desperate job search that had led to that fateful day in Pioneer Park. Jake now spent afternoons in Phoenix's educational programs, learning about aerospace engineering from the same professionals his father worked with daily. "Of course I can judge the competition," David replied. "Are you planning to enter a project?" "I'm designing a microsatellite communication system that uses your synchronization protocols," Jake said with obvious pride. "Mr. Torres from the engineering lab is helping me with the technical specifications." The conversation was interrupted by David's assistant, announcing that Samantha Reynolds had arrived for their weekly strategic planning meeting. These sessions had become collaborative discussions between colleagues who shared mutual respect and common goals, rather than the formal corporate interactions that had characterized their early relationship. Samantha entered David's office carrying coffee and a tablet displaying industry news that would affect Phoenix's competitive position. "David, have you seen the article about Lockheed's satellite integration problems? They're experiencing exactly the kind of timing coordination failures we solved 20 months ago." David reviewed the technical specifications described in the industry report, recognizing the systematic symptoms that had become familiar through his work on similar problems. Their engineering team is trying to solve each subsystem failure independently instead of addressing the integration coordination that's causing the cascading effects. "Should we offer consulting services?" Samantha asked. "Our synchronization protocols could solve their problems in weeks instead of months." David considered the proposal, understanding that Phoenix's technical innovations had created opportunities to provide services to companies that had once been competitors. It would be good business and good engineering. "Let me prepare a technical proposal that outlines how our integration protocols could address their specific symptoms." The meeting continued for an hour, covering strategic initiatives, technical development projects, and partnership opportunities that leveraged David's expertise in ways that generated value for Phoenix while advancing the broader aerospace industry. David's transformation from unemployed applicant to technical leader had created ripple effects that extended far beyond his individual career success. At 4:15 p.m., David and Jake walked through Pioneer Park together, following the same path where David had first recognized the kidnapping attempt that changed both their lives. The park had been renovated with improved security features and new playground equipment, but the basic landscape remained unchanged from that October afternoon when split-second decisions had created lasting consequences. "Dad," Jake said as they sat on the bench where David used to conduct his job search, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been here that day?" David considered the question seriously, understanding that their current happiness had emerged from circumstances that could easily have unfolded differently. "I think about it sometimes. But I also think that when you have the skills to help people, you find ways to use them. Maybe it would have been a different situation, but I believe good things happen when you're prepared to recognize opportunities and act on them. Like how you recognize that the satellite problem was the same as the ground system problem. Exactly like that, pattern recognition and systematic thinking. The same skills that helped me identify the kidnapping attempt helped me diagnose the satellite failure." Jake nodded with the understanding of someone who was beginning to grasp the connections between abstract learning and practical application. I want to learn those skills too. You already are, David replied, pulling his son closer. Every math problem you solve, every science project you complete, every engineering challenge you tackle, you're developing the analytical thinking that makes everything else possible. As the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, David reflected on the journey that had brought them from financial desperation to professional success, from systematic rejection to recognition and respect. The path had been unpredictable and sometimes difficult, but it had led to outcomes that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. David's story had become part of Phoenix Aerospace's corporate culture, cited in hiring training programs as an example of why companies should value competence over credentials, character over conventional qualifications. His experience had influenced policy changes that made Phoenix's recruitment practices more inclusive and more effective at identifying talent from diverse backgrounds. More importantly, David had proven that expertise combined with courage could overcome institutional prejudices, that individual excellence could challenge systemic barriers, and that sometimes the people society overlooks possess exactly the capabilities needed to solve the most important problems. The man who had once been dismissed as unsuitable for corporate standards had become the standard by which technical excellence was measured, demonstrating that heroism came in many forms and that the most important qualifications couldn't be captured on resumes or measured by conventional metrics. David Miller had saved a child, rescued a satellite, and transformed a company's approach to recognizing talent. But most importantly, he had built a life of meaning and purpose that provided security for his son, while contributing to innovations that would benefit countless people he would never meet. Sometimes the people we dismiss without a second thought turn out to be exactly the ones who can save not just our lives, but everything we've worked to build. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.